James Carter stood in his corner office, overlooking the sprawling cityscape below. As CEO of Equinox Trust Bank, he had always taken immense pride in the institution he led, a bank that had, in his eyes, built its reputation on fairness and opportunity. However, recent whispers of discontent had reached his ears, faint but persistent. Clients and employees alike had hinted at something insidious lurking within the walls of his bank. The allegations were alarming. Black customers were being disproportionately denied loans, often without clear justification. Even more unsettling, rumors pointed to an undercurrent of racial bias among the staff, thinly veiled behind polite smiles and procedural excuses. James found it hard to believe. His bank, his leadership, fostering such practices? It went against everything he stood for. Yet, the evidence was mounting. Complaints filtered in, not through official channels but in hushed conversations, anonymous emails, and passing comments during community events. One evening, James attended a charity gala, mingling with prominent figures from various industries. While conversing with an old college acquaintance, a man he deeply respected, the subject of banking arose. "You've done a remarkable job with Equinox, James," the man began, swirling his drink. "But I've got to ask, what's going on with your loan approvals?" James raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" The man hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "I've been hearing from people in the community. Black applicants are saying they're being turned away, even when they meet the criteria. It's starting to make waves, James." James froze. It was one thing to hear murmurs from within. It was another to have the issue raised publicly. "I wasn't aware of this," he said cautiously, though the pit in his stomach told him otherwise. "You might want to look into it," the man replied, his tone both kind and pointed. "Reputation's everything in this business." The next morning, James combed through internal reports and statistics, searching for any anomalies. What he found was damning. Black applicants were twice as likely to have their loans denied as their white counterparts, even when they had similar financial profiles. The disparity was glaring, yet buried beneath layers of bureaucracy and vague justifications. James's frustration mounted as he sifted through case after case. The problem wasn't just the numbers, it was the culture. A chilling pattern emerged in the language used in internal notes. Phrases like risky profile or its potential default appeared disproportionately in files belonging to black customers, often without substantiating evidence. He dug deeper, reviewing complaints submitted by rejected applicants. One customer wrote, "I have excellent credit, a stable job, and more than enough collateral. The only thing I can think of is that my skin color worked against me." Another claimed, "I felt dismissed the moment I walked in. The loan officer wouldn't even look me in the eye." The final blow came during a meeting with the Human Resources Department. James asked pointed questions about staff diversity training and the handling of customer complaints. His executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats, offering vague reassurances and deflecting blame onto outdated systems or isolated incidents. "We'll address it, Mr. Carter," one said. "It's just a few bad apples." "Bad apples," James repeated, his voice icy. "That's your assessment?" The executive stammered. "I mean, it's not systemic." James leaned back, his gaze piercing. "If the ground beneath an orchard is poisoned, do you keep blaming the apples? Or do you fix the soil?" James decided he couldn't rely solely on reports and second-hand accounts. He needed to see the problem with his own eyes. A bold idea began to form in his mind, one that would take him out of his comfort zone but could offer the unfiltered truth he sought. He would go undercover, not as a CEO, but as an ordinary black man, just another customer trying to secure a loan. It was a drastic step, but James knew it was the only way to uncover the biases festering in his institution. That night, he stood in front of his mirror at home, studying his reflection. Gone was the tailored suit and air of authority. In its place, he saw the man he used to be, a young, ambitious black man who had fought tooth and nail to rise above the obstacles placed in his path. He thought about his parents, who had instilled in him the value of hard work and dignity. He thought about his community, the people who looked to him as a beacon of success. And he thought about the weight of his responsibility, not just as a leader, but as a black man in a position of power. If his bank was failing its customers, it was failing him, too. And James Carter wasn't about to let that stand. James Carter sat in the crowded lobby of his own bank, a man transformed by disguise but still burdened by the weight of what he had uncovered. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly as he glanced around, watching the interplay of staff and customers. His sharp, discerning eyes took in every detail, each interaction, searching for signs of the rot he had come to expose. It wasn't long before his worst fears began to manifest before him. A black man in his mid-30s, dressed in a crisp button-down shirt and slacks, approached the counter. He carried himself with quiet confidence, clutching a neatly organized folder under his arm. When he reached the teller, he placed the folder on the counter and smiled politely. "Good afternoon. I'm here to finalize my loan application. I got a call saying everything looked good, so I wanted to stop by in person." The teller, a young woman with bleached blonde hair and a name tag that read Megan, barely glanced up from her computer. She sighed audibly, her manicured nails clicking impatiently against the keyboard. "What's your name again?" she asked, her tone more suited to a reprimand than customer service. "Derek Williams," the man replied, still polite. "I submitted my paperwork 2 weeks ago, and I was told my credit and financials checked out." Megan tapped a few keys, her lips pressed into a thin line. After a moment, she looked up with an expression James could only describe as disdain. "Your loan has been denied." Derek blinked, clearly taken aback. "Denied? But my credit score is 820, and I've been at my job for over a decade. I even provided all the documentation showing my income and assets." Megan shrugged, her indifference palpable. "I don't make the decisions. The system says no." Derek frowned, his voice tinged with frustration but still measured. "Can you at least explain why? I meet all the criteria. Is there someone else I can talk to?" Megan's eyes flickered toward her colleague at the next counter, and she smirked faintly before replying. "Like I said, the system says no. If you want, you can file an appeal. But honestly, it's a long process, and the results don't usually change." James felt his hands clench into fists as he watched the exchange. Derek's shoulders slumped as he gathered his folder, his dignity visibly wounded. He nodded curtly and walked away, his once confident stride now hesitant. The humiliation wasn't over. An elderly black woman shuffled up to the counter next, her movements slow and deliberate. Her hands trembled slightly as she handed over her account details. "I'm here to withdraw from my savings," she said softly, her voice quivering with age. The teller glanced at the computer screen, her expression shifting from bored to irritated. "There's no money in this account." The woman blinked, confusion etched into every wrinkle on her face. "That can't be right. I've been saving for years. I haven't withdrawn anything." "Well, there's nothing here now," the teller replied bluntly, leaning back in her chair. "Please, there must be some mistake," the woman pleaded, her voice cracking. "This is my life savings. It's all I have." The teller rolled her eyes and called over a manager, a stout man with an air of authority and a perpetually furrowed brow. He didn't bother to look at the woman as he spoke. "If there's no balance, there's nothing we can do." She probably miscalculated. The woman's hands gripped the edge of the counter for support. "Miscalculated?" she whispered. "I've been keeping track of every penny." "Look, ma'am," the manager said impatiently, "if you have an issue, you can submit a claim. But I'm telling you now, there's nothing in the account." The dismissiveness, the complete lack of empathy, was like a physical blow to James. He felt his jaw tighten as he watched the elderly woman shuffle away, her despair evident in every step. James began noticing other details around the room. A white customer, whose conversation he overheard, appeared to be applying for a loan with less than stellar credit. The teller assisting him smiled warmly, even cracking a joke. "Let's see what we can do to help you out," she said, her tone pleasant and accommodating. Contrast this with another black customer who approached the same teller minutes later. The warmth vanished, replaced by a curt, robotic demeanor. The customer, a young woman, asked about opening a savings account, but the teller's responses were terse, as though she were doing her a favor by answering at all. It was the same pattern over and over. Politeness and patience extended to white customers, hostility and indifference to black ones. James felt his stomach churn as he absorbed it all, the evidence mounting with every passing moment. But the final straw came when a father entered the bank with his teenage son, both dressed in neatly pressed clothes. The father explained that he wanted to open a joint account for his son to teach him about financial responsibility. The teller raised an eyebrow. "Do you have 2 forms of ID?" "Yes, I brought everything," the father replied, handing over the documents. The teller inspected them, her expression skeptical. "I'll have to get these verified," she said, standing and disappearing into the back. James watched as the father and son stood there, waiting patiently. 15 minutes passed. Then 20. The father approached the counter to ask for an update, only to be waved off by another staff member. Finally, the teller returned, her expression unapologetic. "Sorry, but we can't open the account." The system flagged an issue. "What issue?" the father asked, his tone calm but firm. "Can't say," she replied, already turning her attention to the next customer. The father sighed, putting a hand on his son's shoulder. "Let's go," he said quietly, leading the boy out of the bank. James caught the boy's expression, confusion mixed with shame. As James left the bank later that day, his heart was heavy with anger and sorrow. He had seen enough to confirm the accusations, but the depth of the problem went beyond what he had imagined. His staff wasn't just indifferent. They were actively hostile, perpetuating humiliation and despair among black customers who deserved better. James knew this wasn't just a problem of individuals or isolated incidents. It was systemic, ingrained in the culture of the institution he had worked so hard to build. And now, it was his responsibility to tear it down. James Carter sat in his dimly lit study, his laptop open to a spreadsheet that detailed the loan approval rates at Equinox Trust Bank. The stark numbers stared back at him like an indictment. Black customers were denied loans at nearly twice the rate of white customers. His stomach churned as he traced the patterns, noting case after case where seemingly qualified black applicants were rejected without justification. It wasn't incompetence, it was deliberate. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. The discoveries he had made over the past few weeks weighed heavily on him. This wasn't a case of a few bad employees, this was systemic. The bank he had worked so hard to build into a symbol of success and trust was instead riddled with rot. His decision to go undercover had exposed the indifference and hostility in the bank's branches, but now, digging deeper into internal records and secretive communications, James was uncovering a far more insidious scheme. The discrimination wasn't just passive, it was active, orchestrated, and deeply embedded in the culture of his institution. One particularly damning file caught his attention, a report from a branch manager discussing risk mitigation strategies. The coded language was thinly veiled. Underneath innocuous terms like risk evaluation, the reality was that black customers were disproportionately categorized as high risk, even when their credit scores and financial profiles were stellar. In one email thread, a loan officer openly questioned why a black customer with an 800 credit score had been rejected. The response from the branch manager was chilling. Sometimes it's not just about the numbers. Trust is built on more than spreadsheets. It was a euphemism, James realized, for racial profiling. Another email exchange revealed an even darker aspect of the scheme. A senior manager discussed alternative incentives for loan officers, suggesting that they subtly hint to black applicants that approval might be expedited if they were willing to sweeten the deal. The language was vague but unmistakable. It encouraged staff to solicit bribes. James's anger boiled over as he read further. Not only were black customers being denied the loans they were entitled to, but some were being extorted under the guise of helping them navigate the system. The next day, James decided to visit another branch, still in disguise as an ordinary customer. He arrived just as the doors opened, blending in with the morning crowd. He chose a seat near the loan officer desks, pretending to review paperwork while keeping his ears open. He didn't have to wait long to witness the discrimination in action. A young black woman approached a loan officer, her head held high despite the tension in her posture. She introduced herself and explained that she was following up on her application for a small business loan. The loan officer, a middle-aged man with a condescending air, barely glanced at her documents. "We've reviewed your application," he said flatly, "and unfortunately, it doesn't meet our criteria." The woman frowned. "I don't understand. My credit score is 790, and I've been running my business profitably for 3 years. What part of my application doesn't meet the criteria?" The loan officer leaned back in his chair, his tone dismissive. "We're not obligated to provide detailed explanations for every decision." James watched as the woman's face fell, her frustration palpable. She tried to press further, but the loan officer shut her down with a final, "You can try applying again in 6 months." Moments later, a white man in a rumpled shirt and khakis approached the same loan officer. He laughed awkwardly as he explained that his credit wasn't great and that he didn't have much in the way of collateral, but he was hoping for a personal loan. To James's disbelief, the loan officer's demeanor shifted entirely. He became friendly, even encouraging. "Let's see what we can do," he said, pulling up the man's information. The disparity was glaring. As James continued his undercover investigation, he began hearing whispers from the staff themselves. One afternoon, while waiting in line, he overheard 2 tellers gossiping near the break room. "Did you hear about the guy at Main Street?" one asked. "Oh, the one who got caught asking for cash under the table? Yeah. Management just gave him a slap on the wrist. Said he was being proactive." James's blood ran cold. The casual tone with which they discussed bribery and the lack of consequences spoke volumes. Later, he overheard a senior staff member joking with a colleague about a black customer who had become visibly upset after being denied a loan. "Did you see his face?" the man said, laughing. "I thought he was going to flip the desk." The colleague chuckled. "They always think they deserve something. Like, just because they've got a decent score, we're supposed to hand them cash." James clenched his jaw, his hands trembling with anger. Determined to gather irrefutable evidence, James accessed internal performance reviews of his loan officers. He discovered that employees who rejected more applications, particularly from black customers, were often praised for their discretion and rigorous standards. Meanwhile, those who approved loans for black customers were scrutinized more heavily, their decisions second-guessed by upper management. But perhaps the most shocking revelation came when James stumbled upon a training manual from a few years prior. Buried deep in the document was a section on client evaluation. While it didn't explicitly mention race, the examples provided all depicted black individuals as high-risk borrowers, while white customers were portrayed as trustworthy. It was clear that the bank's culture had been shaped by years of systemic racism, reinforced by policies that rewarded prejudice and punished fairness. James sat in his office late one night, staring at the mountain of evidence he had compiled. The faces of the people he had seen, Derek, the elderly woman, the young business owner, flashed through his mind. They weren't just statistics, they were lives, dreams, and dignity crushed under the weight of an unjust system. He thought back to his own journey, to the countless obstacles he had faced as a black man in a world that often judged him before knowing him. He had worked tirelessly to rise above the prejudice, to build a legacy of success. And now, that legacy was tainted. But James wasn't defeated. If anything, his resolve had hardened. He knew dismantling this system wouldn't be easy. It would require more than policy changes. It would demand a complete overhaul of the bank's culture, starting with those at the top. James Carter, the man who had built Equinox Trust Bank into a powerhouse, was about to become its fiercest critic and its greatest hope for redemption. James Carter sat in his modest apartment, the one he'd rented under his assumed identity, surrounded by stacks of paperwork he'd meticulously prepared for his loan application. Every detail had been perfected. A spotless credit history, substantial savings, and a steady income from a fictional small business he had crafted with the precision of a man who knew the system inside and out. Yet, despite the strength of his application, a sense of foreboding clung to him. He knew the odds weren't in his favor, not in the bank he now understood was steeped in bias. The following day, he walked into one of Equinox Trust Bank's busiest branches. The lobby was bustling, the air thick with the murmur of transactions and the faint hum of printers. James felt a familiar unease as he approached the loan officer's desk, a knot tightening in his stomach despite knowing his financial credentials were impeccable. The loan officer, a young man named Andrew, gave James a cursory glance before focusing on his computer screen. Andrew's demeanor was indifferent, his tone clipped as he asked James for his documents. James handed over the neatly organized folder and watched as Andrew began typing, the tension in the room thickening with each keystroke. "You're applying for a $50,000 business loan," Andrew said, not looking up from the screen. "Yes," James replied evenly. Andrew nodded and continued typing, his expression betraying nothing. Several minutes passed in silence, the officer's brow furrowing as he scrolled through James's application. Finally, Andrew leaned back in his chair, a faint smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Unfortunately, your application doesn't meet our criteria," he said, his voice laced with finality. James's heart sank, though he'd anticipated this outcome. Still, he pressed on. "I don't understand. My credit score is 815, and I've provided documentation for stable income and sufficient collateral. Could you explain what criteria I failed to meet?" Andrew's smirk deepened as he folded his hands on the desk. "The system flagged your application as high risk," he said, his tone patronizing. "I'm not at liberty to go into details." James stared at him, his jaw tightening. He knew the system inside and out. There was no legitimate reason for his application to be flagged. He took a deep breath, determined to push further. "Is there someone else I can speak to? A manager, perhaps?" Andrew hesitated, his eyes flickering with annoyance. "The manager is busy," he said curtly. "But there are other ways we could look into your case." James raised an eyebrow. "Other ways?" Andrew leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Sometimes we can expedite the process if applicants are willing to, show their commitment. An additional payment might help demonstrate your seriousness." The words hung in the air, their implication unmistakable. James felt a surge of anger, but he kept his expression neutral. "And how much would this additional payment be?" he asked. Andrew shrugged, a faint gleam in his eyes. "Depends. 5,000, maybe 10. It's not official, of course, but it can go a long way in smoothing things out." James stared at him, disgust curling in his stomach. The corruption was blatant, the racism implicit in every word and gesture. He stood abruptly, gathering his documents without another word. Andrew's smirk faltered as James walked away, his silence louder than any protest. The rejection stung, not because of the money, but because it underscored the depth of the rot within his own institution. James had built Equinox Trust Bank to be a beacon of opportunity, a symbol of his hard-won success. Now, he saw it for what it truly was, a place where bias and corruption thrived, crushing the dreams of those who deserved better. But James wasn't done uncovering the truth. His investigation soon led him to the experiences of black employees within the bank, and what he found was equally damning. One evening, James met with Derek Williams, the man he'd seen humiliated at the loan counter weeks earlier. Derek worked as a mid-level manager in the bank's headquarters, overseeing a small team in the compliance department. Over coffee in a quiet cafe, Derek shared his story. "It's not just the customers, Mr. Carter," Derek began, his voice heavy with frustration. "It's us too. Black employees. We hit a ceiling, no matter how hard we work or how qualified we are." James listened intently as Derek detailed the subtle but pervasive barriers he faced. Promotions were rare, and when they did happen, they often came with strings attached, more responsibilities but no increase in pay or authority. Derek recounted how his ideas were frequently dismissed in meetings, only to be praised when a white colleague presented the same concepts. "There's this unspoken rule," Derek said, his tone bitter. "Keep your head down, don't make waves, and maybe you'll get to keep your job. But don't expect to rise." James nodded, his chest tightening with anger. He had suspected discrimination against black employees, but hearing it laid bare was devastating. Derek's voice dropped as he leaned in. "And then there's the harassment. It's subtle, but it's there. Snide comments, people questioning your qualifications, the way they look at you like you don't belong." James felt a wave of shame. He had worked so hard to climb the corporate ladder, to build his empire, but in doing so, he had unknowingly allowed others to be crushed underfoot. In the days that followed, James spoke to more employees, their stories echoing Derek's. A young black woman in the marketing department shared how she had been passed over for a promotion in favor of a less qualified white colleague. A black IT specialist recounted how he was constantly scrutinized by his supervisors, his every move questioned in ways his white counterparts never experienced. One employee, a janitor named Leon, revealed that he had been working at the bank for over 20 years without so much as a raise. "They treat us like we're invisible," Leon said quietly, his eyes reflecting years of hurt. "Like we're just here to clean up after them and keep quiet?" By the end of his investigation, James had compiled a mountain of evidence: blatant racism in loan approvals, corruption in the form of bribes, and systemic discrimination against black employees. The weight of it all pressed down on him, but it also fueled his determination. He had seen enough. It was time to take action. James Carter sat across from Lauren Green, Equinox Trust Bank's internal auditor, in a small conference room illuminated by the dim glow of a desk lamp. The air between them was tense but charged with purpose. Lauren, a sharp-eyed woman with a reputation for integrity, had been one of the few people within the organization James could trust. She had worked for the bank for over a decade, quietly earning respect for her meticulous work and unwavering principles. "I've suspected for a while," Lauren said, her voice steady but laced with frustration. "I've seen the patterns, but I didn't have the power to act on them. They bury the numbers deep, James. The discrimination isn't just a byproduct. It's deliberate, systemic." James nodded, his hands resting on a folder brimming with documents he had gathered over weeks of investigation. "We have to expose this, Lauren. Not just the staff involved, but the executives who allowed this culture to thrive. This bank needs a reckoning." Lauren leaned forward, her gaze fierce. "If we're going to do this, we need hard evidence. Not just the data, you'll need testimonies, a trail of decisions, and someone who can tie it all together." James exhaled deeply, feeling the weight of what lay ahead. "I've already started reaching out," he said. "There are organizations that fight this kind of injustice, and I've contacted someone who can help us, Noah Porter. He's a former federal agent with experience in uncovering corporate corruption." Lauren's eyebrows lifted in approval. "But if we're taking this fight public, we'll need someone with his expertise." The days that followed were a whirlwind of covert meetings, late-night phone calls, and meticulous planning. James and Lauren worked in secrecy, knowing that any leak of their efforts could result in retaliation from the very institution they sought to reform. Noah Porter, a grizzled man with a calm demeanor and a penetrating gaze, joined them as their investigation deepened. A veteran of countless corporate scandals, Noah brought a strategic mind and an unwavering determination to their cause. "You've got a mountain of evidence," Noah said, poring over the documents James and Lauren had compiled. "Now we need to connect the dots, prove not just that discrimination is happening, but that it's orchestrated." James tapped a spreadsheet on the table. "These are the rejection rates by race, branch, and loan officer. They show clear bias, but I know the higher-ups will argue that it's just statistical noise. That's where the emails come in." Lauren slid a stack of printouts across the table. "These show internal communications, managers instructing staff to flag black applicants as high risk, even when their profiles are strong. And this one," she said, pointing to a particularly damning email, "is from a regional director, praising a branch for reducing unnecessary approvals. That's code for denying loans to people they don't want." Noah nodded grimly. "This is good, but we'll need witnesses, employees willing to testify about what they've seen and experienced." James reached out to Derek Williams, the compliance manager he had spoken to weeks earlier. Over a private dinner, Derek agreed to help. "I'm tired of staying silent," Derek said, his voice heavy with resolve. "If this means I lose my job, so be it. People need to know the truth." Other employees began to come forward as well. A young marketing associate shared how her promotions were repeatedly blocked by her manager, who once told her, "You don't fit the image we're looking for." Leon, the janitor who had been ignored for decades, offered his story, detailing years of demeaning treatment and racial slurs from staff. The testimonies were damning, But the most explosive revelation came from an anonymous whistleblower, a mid-level executive who had secretly recorded meetings where senior leaders discussed ways to protect the bank's brand by avoiding risky demographics. The recordings were brutal to hear. In one, a senior vice president said, "We can't afford to hand out loans to people who won't pay them back. We need to be selective, avoid anyone who might look bad for our bottom line." Lauren's jaw clenched as she listened. "That's it," she said. "This isn't just implicit bias. This is policy." With the evidence mounting, James and his team contacted several human rights organizations, including the National Fair Housing Alliance and the NAACP. These groups brought their resources and legal expertise to the fight, helping to craft a strategy for exposing the bank's practices. At the same time, Noah worked tirelessly to coordinate with media outlets. "The public needs to see this," he said. "When this story breaks, it has to be undeniable." The day of reckoning came sooner than expected. Armed with their evidence, James, Lauren, and Noah presented their findings to a trusted journalist at a major national newspaper. Within days, the story broke. Systemic racism at Equinox Trust Bank, a culture of discrimination exposed. The article detailed everything: the rejection rates, the internal emails, the whistleblowers' recordings, and the heartbreaking stories of customers and employees who had suffered under the bank's policies. The media storm was immediate and unforgiving. Protesters gathered outside Equinox branches, holding signs that read, "Justice for all" and "Stop the discrimination." Customers began closing their accounts en masse, and social media was flooded with calls for accountability. Inside the bank, chaos erupted. Executives scrambled to contain the fallout, but it was too late. Federal regulators launched an investigation, and lawsuits from both customers and employees piled up. James stood in the middle of it all, a man determined to see this fight through to the end. Despite the backlash, he refused to back down. He held press conferences, gave interviews, and met with community leaders, vowing to dismantle the discriminatory system that had plagued his bank. Lauren stayed by his side, her expertise and unwavering commitment driving the reform efforts. Together, they began implementing sweeping changes, firing corrupt executives, overhauling hiring practices, and introducing strict anti-discrimination policies. Derek Williams was promoted to a senior compliance role, tasked with ensuring the bank's new policies were enforced. Leon, the janitor, was given a raise and publicly recognized for his decades of service. As the dust began to settle, James reflected on the journey. The fight had been brutal, and the scars would remain, but change was finally taking root. Equinox Trust Bank was no longer a symbol of injustice. It was becoming a beacon of hope. But James knew the work was far from over. The fight for justice was ongoing, and he was ready to lead it. The days following the exposé were a storm of scrutiny and upheaval for Equinox Trust Bank. Protests erupted outside the main branches, the media dissected every detail of the scandal, and customers pulled their accounts in droves. James Carter, once celebrated as a visionary CEO, found himself at the center of public outrage. Yet, amid the chaos, James stood resolute. He hadn't fought so hard to expose the truth only to abandon the battle now. Sitting in the CEO's office late one night, James stared at the piles of documents on his desk. These weren't the usual financial reports and projections but blueprints for a new Equinox, a bank that would rise from the ashes of corruption and discrimination to become a model of integrity and equality. He had already survived the hardest part, uncovering the rot. Now it was time to rebuild. The first step was accountability. James convened an emergency board meeting, flanked by Lauren Green and Derek Williams. Lauren, with her sharp auditing skills, laid out the depth of the systemic failures in excruciating detail. Derek, now serving as senior compliance officer, presented a comprehensive plan for rooting out the individuals responsible. "This isn't just about firing a few bad actors," James said, his voice firm. "It's about dismantling the culture that allowed this to happen." Several executives and managers implicated in the scandal were terminated immediately, their names made public to underscore the bank's commitment to transparency. For James, these firings were just the beginning. He issued a clear directive to all remaining staff: Equinox Trust would adopt a zero-tolerance policy on racism and corruption. Any employee found engaging in discriminatory practices would face immediate dismissal and possible legal action. To rebuild trust, James knew he had to make sweeping changes that went beyond punishment. He called for a complete overhaul of the bank's operations, starting with transparency. Every loan application, every financial decision, and every employee performance review would now be subject to stringent oversight. "We will track every transaction," Lauren explained during a staff-wide meeting, her tone unyielding. "And we will identify patterns that suggest bias or corruption. If you're doing your job fairly and ethically, you have nothing to worry about. If not, you will be held accountable." James also mandated the creation of a Diversity and Inclusion Council, chaired by Derek Williams, to ensure that employees from all backgrounds had equal opportunities for advancement. The council was tasked with reviewing hiring practices, promotions, and workplace policies to eliminate the barriers that had long hindered Black employees. For Leon, the janitor who had worked for decades without recognition, these changes were transformative. When he was promoted to facilities supervisor, a role that came with a significant pay raise, he was initially hesitant. "I've never had anyone believe in me like this before," he told James during a quiet moment. "Leon," James replied, placing a hand on his shoulder, "this isn't charity. It's justice. You've earned this." Employee training became another cornerstone of the reforms. James partnered with human rights organizations to develop a comprehensive ethics and inclusivity program, which all employees were required to complete. The training sessions were intense and often uncomfortable, forcing staff to confront their biases and understand the impact of their actions on others. "I thought I was just doing my job," one teller admitted during a session. "But now I see how I was part of the problem. I didn't speak up when I should have." The training also included simulations designed to show employees what it felt like to be on the receiving end of discrimination. For many, these exercises were eye-opening. James participated in the sessions himself, setting an example for the rest of the staff. "If we're going to change this bank," he said during one training, "we all have to change ourselves first." For customers, the reforms were just as comprehensive. James introduced a new transparency policy that allowed applicants to see exactly how their loans were evaluated, with detailed explanations for any rejections. This eliminated the secrecy that had allowed bias to flourish. Equinox Trust also partnered with community organizations to offer financial literacy programs, particularly in underserved neighborhoods. These programs provided guidance on building credit, applying for loans, and managing finances, tools that empowered customers to take control of their economic futures. The road to redemption was not without challenges. Many employees resisted the changes, grumbling about the increased scrutiny and new policies. Some even quit, unwilling to adapt to the new culture. But James remained steadfast. "If they can't uphold the values we're building here, they don't belong at Equinox," he told Lauren during one particularly frustrating week. The media, initially relentless in its criticism, began to take notice of the progress. Stories emerged about how the bank was transforming itself, how employees like Derek and Leon were finally being recognized for their contributions, and how customers were experiencing a new level of fairness and respect. 1 year after the scandal broke, James stood on a stage at a community event, addressing a crowd that included customers, employees, and representatives from human rights organizations. "We failed you," he said, his voice resonating with conviction. "For years, Equinox Trust allowed discrimination and corruption to thrive. And for that, I am deeply sorry. But we are not the same bank we were a year ago. We are rebuilding, brick by brick, policy by policy, to become a symbol of what's possible when we confront injustice head-on." The applause that followed was not just for James but for the entire team that had worked tirelessly to turn the bank around. Lauren, standing off to the side, smiled as she watched James speak, knowing that their work was far from over but proud of how far they had come. Derek, now a prominent figure within the bank, felt the sense of pride he hadn't known was possible. "We're not just changing a bank," he said to Leon, who stood beside him. "We're changing lives." Leon nodded, his gaze steady. "About time too." Equinox Trust Bank didn't just recover, It became a model of equality and transparency in the financial sector. Other institutions began adopting similar reforms, inspired by the changes James had implemented. But for James, the greatest victory wasn't in the accolades or the restored reputation. It was in the stories of customers and employees who finally felt seen, heard, and valued. As he looked out over the crowd that day, James felt a quiet satisfaction. The fight for justice was never easy, but it was always worth it. Equinox Trust Bank had been broken, but now it was whole again, a testament to the power of accountability, integrity, and the relentless pursuit of what is right.